Today's pattern is the drop waist dress from Tiana's closet. What drew me to this dress is that it reminds me of the 1920s, and this embroidered eyelet trim makes such a beautiful hem. You can find this rayon challis in black and white at Boho Fabrics. This pattern features an all-in-one facing which cleanly finishes the neckline and armholes, and a gathered skirt. You can find another version of this dress on the website to create a double ruffle if you like as well. I'm using my pressing hams again today, a game changer for pressing the curves along the facing edges, and I'll link them below. I didn't make any changes to the pattern, sewing a straight extra small. I may go back and shorten the dress a little at the drop waist seam, but it's lovely either way. Let's sew it together now. Here is my front dress piece with my darts marked. I'm going to pin them in place. Now I'm going to take it to my machine and sew from the outside edge to the point and leave thread tails at each point so I can tie them in knots. After you sew the darts, you can press them downward. Then I'm going to finish the raw edges of the shoulder seams and the side seams. Just using my serger to finish those edges separately for the shoulders and for each of the sides, doing this for the front and back pieces. I'll place my front and back dress pieces right sides together so that I can pin the shoulder seams and side seams. I'll sew both of the side seams and both of the shoulder seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then I'm going to press the seams open. I've applied interfacing to the wrong sides of my front and back facing pieces. Now I can place them right sides together, aligning the shoulders and side seams and pinning in place. Now I'll sew these seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Once both of the facings are connected at the shoulders and side seams, we're going to finish the bottom raw edges all the way around. I'm going to turn the facing inside out and place it right sides together with the neckline. I'll match the shoulder seams and pin in place and then continue pinning around the neckline. Now we can sew the facing to the neckline with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to clip into the curves of the neckline all the way around so that when I turn the facing to the inside of the garment, everything lies nice and flat. We're clipping through that seam allowance, careful not to clip through the stitching. Now we're going to understitch the neckline. Turn the facing over its seam allowance. And we're going to sew the facing to the seam allowance 1/8 of an inch away from the stitching line. Now I'm going to turn the facing to the inside of the garment. Use a tailor's ham to get a nice curved press along that neckline. I'll link this tailor's ham in the description. To finish each of the armhole edges, there are a few options. The easiest way is to baste those edges together all the way around, and then use bias tape to finish the edges, turning them to the inside. As I've done here, I'd like to create an all-in-one facing so that the armholes look exactly the same as the neckline finish. At the underarm seam, I'm going to turn those seam allowances to the inside so that at the underarm point, the materials are right sides together. Then I'm going to place my hand in between the front and back dress pieces and grab that underarm seam from the inside. Now I'll place a pin at that underarm seam. Now I'll turn those seam allowances to be right sides together in the same way at the shoulder seam and grab them from the inside once again and pin together. Things will be a little bit tight at this shoulder seam, so just work the material around that seam so that everything is lying nice and flat. Now that we have those two landmarks in place and pinned, we can continue pinning from seam to seam on one side of the armhole. Now we're going to sew from shoulder seam to underarm seam with a 3/8 inch seam allowance backstitching at both points. Now we have one half of the armhole finished. Now we can access and pin the remainder of the armhole from underarm seam to shoulder seam. Once again, working that tight material at the shoulder so that everything lies nice and flat, and pinning the remainder of the armhole right sides together. I have the remainder of the armhole pinned from shoulder seam to side seam, and I'm going to sew this section exactly as I did on the other side of the armhole, backstitching at both sides to secure. Now I've turned that facing fully to the inside of the garment, and we have a nice fully encased armhole. All we have to do now is understitch just as we did for the neckline. Open out that facing flat so that only the seam allowance is underneath it, and we'll sew the facing to its seam allowance all the way around. Since those shoulder areas are tight and interconnected, we'll have to stop and start our stitching around the shoulder seam. Understitch from the shoulder all the way around the underarm to the opposite shoulder, backstitching on both ends to secure. Now our neckline and armholes look just the same, with a very nice and clean finish. I've gone ahead and finished each of the side edges for the front and back skirt piece. Now I'm going to place them right sides together and pin each of the side seams. I'll sew the side seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press them open. Now for the front and back skirt piece, I'm going to sew basting stitches from one side seam to the other, breaking my stitches at both side seams and starting again for the opposite skirt piece, leaving thread tails on both ends for each set of stitches so that we have threads to pull for gathering. Place that gathered skirt piece right sides together with the bottom of the dress, aligning that raw gathered edge with the raw bottom edge of the dress. I'm going to start by matching both of my side seams and pinning in place. Then I can pull the gathering stitches so that the bottom skirt matches the bottom of the dress, and pin in place all the way around. Now we're going to sew the skirt to the dress with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then finish the raw edges together all the way around. Since the fabric that I'm using has a finished decorative edge along the bottom, I don't need to do anything further and my dress is complete. Otherwise, you can hem your dress in your desired method, and this drop waist dress is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.